At first, I never really minded working the overnight shift at the 7-Eleven near my house, but that changed when they switched it from 2 staff members overnight to 1. Once I was by myself, as a girl I immediately felt less safe in that store overnight, especially since I was only a teenager fresh out of high school at the time. I tried my best to make it work, but the pressure was starting to get to me. And then on the night before I told my manager that I needed to switch shifts, my worst fears came true. It was a little bit after midnight, and it was a surprisingly busy night, believe it or not. Usually by that point, the only people that stop by are just getting gas, but for some reason, we had a few people in the store grabbing some things that they needed. As I sat there checking out a person's order and getting ready to hand them their change, I couldn't help but notice that there was one man who was standing toward the back of the store. He seemed like he was making it look like he was shopping, but then never picked anything up. And every now and then, I swear that I would feel him looking up toward the register. I kept looking over at him to make sure that he wasn't trying to steal anything, but every time I did, he just looked away. Then one by one, everybody in the store began to bring their items up to the register and then left the store. Everyone except for him. Once that last other person walked out the door and got into their car, I looked over to the man and saw that he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He was looking right up at me from the other side of the store. I tried to stay calm, but something in my gut told me that I needed to get out of that store as fast as I could. I slowly started to walk away from the register and towards the phone that was on the wall behind me, but as soon as I took a step, the man began running towards the counter. I screamed as he climbed over the small barrier that usually separated me from the customers, and before I knew it, I was staring down the barrel of a small handgun. He began yelling for me to put the phone down as he continued to push the gun in my face, and once I did, he grabbed me by the collar and threw me toward the register. He demanded that I take the money out and give it to him, as well as wanting me to scan a handful of scratch-off tickets for him. I could hear him rummaging through the cigarettes on the wall behind me as I scanned the tickets, but I was too afraid to try to escape for fear of being shot. After I was all done, I hoped that he would just leave, but instead, he tried to pull me away from the counter. I tried to fight him off, but quickly realized it was pointless when I felt the hard metal of the gun hit me in the back side of my head. I could feel myself getting more and more lightheaded as the man dragged me across the store and toward the walk-in freezer. After dragging me inside, he dropped me onto the floor and then left me there to freeze. He closed the door behind me, and I'll never forget the sound of the lock latching from the other side. I tried to sit up, but the head wound was making my head throb. That was when I realized that he didn't take my phone out of my pocket before leaving me. I managed to slowly move around and muster the strength to pull the phone out of my pocket, but as I dialed 911, I started to get dizzy. And just as I heard the operator's voice answer, my head fell to the floor and I passed out. The next thing I remember is waking up in the back of an ambulance before being brought to the hospital to get a few stitches in the side of my head. Thankfully, the police were able to use the GPS from my phone to find my location and get help to me. The very next day, I called my boss and told them that I needed to switch off the night shift, and she totally understood. For a while, I was working midday shifts as a security guard over at a small hotel that was only 5 minutes away from my house, and I couldn't have asked for a better job. That all changed though when I got transferred for a week to work security over at an abandoned building that had just been purchased for remodeling. It wasn't so much the abandoned building part that bothered me at first, it was the overnights. I never really had good experiences working overnight as a security guard, and this certainly wouldn't change that. On my first night at the building, nothing seemed too bad. I had to do a few walkthroughs of the place, but for the most part, I was able to just sit at my desk in the front of the building and make sure that no one tried to vandalize the place or have any parties. I'll never forget how surprisingly quiet it was in the building on that first night. There was no electricity or plumbing active in the building at the time, so it was practically silent. That all changed on the second night. It was about 10:15 and I was just starting to do my second pass through of the building when I had to stop myself. I began shining my flashlight around as I listened closely. I wasn't quite sure what it was at first, but I could definitely hear a sound coming from deeper into the building. I slowly made my way down the hallway with my flashlight pointing forward, and as I got closer to the source of the noise, it continued to get loud. I stopped myself before rounding a corner as I took in a deep breath. Not knowing what to expect since I still couldn't really recognize the sound, I was hesitant to go any further. I listened closely, hoping to identify the noise, but all I could make out was this strange scratching sort of sound. That's when my head jumped to the conclusion that there was an animal somewhere in the building. Sadly, that wasn't the case, and I ended up being wrong. Before I realized that though, I walked around the corner with confidence, expecting to see some sign of raccoons or something in the hallway. But to my surprise, there was nothing there. I looked around and listened to reassure myself that the scratching sound was coming from that direction, and then I continued to walk toward it. I was standing in the middle of the hall when the sound was loudest, and I quickly realized that it was coming from the other side of the wall. At that point, I still expected it to be some sort of animal to be in the wall because of the scratching noise, but now I was thinking I might have to check each of the rooms to see where it got in from. But again, I was wrong. I slowly approached the entrance to the room that I was closest to and got ready to place my hand on the door and open it. I took in a deep breath, hoping that there wasn't anything dangerous on the other side, and then slowly opened the door and stepped into the room. I almost jumped out of my skin when I looked toward the wall that I heard the scratching sound coming from, because to my surprise, instead of an animal, I saw a person crouched over in the corner, clawing violently at the wall. I tried to step back out of the room without them noticing me, but as the floorboard creaked when I took the weight of my left foot off of it, they snapped their head in my direction. Even though I was clearly looking at a grown man, it was almost as if I was staring down a horrifying predator as he bared his teeth at me and began to scream as violently as he was clawing at the wall. I started to step back out of the room as fast as I could when the man stood from his crouched position and began running toward me. I slammed the door shut behind me and began running through the building back toward the front entrance. With every step that I took as I ran, I could hear the man behind me making these strange shrieking-like noises as he chased me through the halls. Thankfully, I managed to keep my distance from him as I reached my station and grabbed the radio that I used to communicate with my manager on duty. After grabbing the radio, I continued running until I was out of the building, and then I let my boss know that he needed to get the police down to the building as fast as they could. I kept my distance from the building, but continued to watch the front door to see if the man who chased me had left, but I didn't see anything. That being said, by the time the police got there, he must have escaped the same way that he snuck in, because there was no sign of the man. We went back to the room that I found him in and checked out the wall that he was clawing through, and we couldn't find anything. But according to the officers, the man was likely looking for copper wiring to scrap or sell for whatever habits he had. No matter what his reasoning was for being there, I let my boss know that I either needed another guard with me overnight or I needed to be transferred to a different building. They were very understanding and actually ended up sending me back to the small hotel that I was working at before the overnight shifts. My first maintenance job was for a building in Chicago back in 1996, and to this day I can say that I've never worked another job like it. The position was for an overnight maintenance worker / building superintendent, and as soon as they offered me the job, I took it. It came with an office in the basement that I shared with the daytime workers, and I got 3 days off every week, so all in all, it didn't seem too bad on paper. But I learned pretty quickly that I would need to entertain myself because there weren't a lot of problems that needed my attendance overnight. According to the other workers though, that wouldn't be the case during the winter with all of the pipes freezing, so I tried not to get used to it. It was probably the middle of my second week on the job when I got my first official call. and it was up to a new resident that had moved in on the 4th floor. He called in saying that water wasn't coming out of the shower head, so I grabbed my tools and made my way upstairs as fast as I could, eager to show that I was capable of doing good work. And when I got there, I was relieved to find that it was a really easy job. In fact, he probably didn't even need to call me, because the only problem was that the water hookup to the shower was turned to the off position so the water wouldn't pass through the pipe. All I had to do was turn the valve and they were good to go. However, as I went to say bye and to wish them good night, the man stopped me to thank me for my work. I told him that it was no problem at all, and he asked me if I worked the following night. I responded by saying that I do, and if he needed anything to just call down and I'll be up to help. I went back down to the maintenance office after that and had a relatively boring rest of the night. The next day on my shift, I was surprised when I heard a knock on the door. I answered it and saw the tenant that I had helped out the other day with a bag of McDonald's. At first, I tried to tell him that I wasn't able to have visitors in the office, but he was persistent. He said he just wanted to thank me for helping out, so eventually I invited him in to enjoy a burger and fries. I thought he was a little strange with the way he talked, but that changed as we got to know each other a bit better. I learned that he had just moved to Chicago from New York, and we eventually agreed to hang out sometime so I could introduce him to some people. Not long after that, he went back up to his apartment, and that was the last time I saw anyone that night since no one needed any help in their apartments. The following day, around the same time, I heard a knock on the door again, and when I answered it, I wasn't surprised this time to see that same tenant. This time though, things seemed a bit different about him. I told him that I was expecting a pretty busy night and didn't really have time for a meal again, but this time he said that he brought drinks. I chuckled a bit thinking that he was joking because I obviously couldn't drink on the job, but he didn't like that. As soon as I started laughing at what I thought was a joke, the man locked eyes with me and asked in a very quiet voice if I was laughing at him. I told him that I wasn't and that I thought he was making a joke, but by that point, he was already trying to force his way into the office. I tried to hold the door shut, but despite him being a bit smaller than I was, he was able to push right through it. I stepped back as the tenant entered the office, yelling about how I shouldn't go around laughing at people. I tried to explain to him that I didn't mean to offend him, but once he was in better lighting and I saw how big his pupils were, I realized that I wasn't dealing with someone who was sober. I asked the man to please calm down one more time, but before I could finish the word down, he threw the bag of bottles that he was holding in my direction. I tried to catch them, but they slipped right through my hands and smacked me in the bottom of my chin and my throat. I stumbled backward as the man lunged at me. I tried to fight him off as I caught my breath, but it was no use. He easily managed to force me to the ground and then with both hands around my neck, began choking me. The sound of his jumbled screaming began to fade out as everything around me started to turn black. And just like that, I was out. I'm pretty sure that the tenant had thought he killed me, but I ended up waking up sometime later to find that my wallet was missing, as well as the TV in the office and the landline. I went to the first floor and used another tenant's phone to call the police, and they went up to talk to the man who attacked me, but he was nowhere to be found. After searching his apartment, the officers couldn't figure out where he had gone, but they found what they believed to be a trap for me waiting in his room. According to them, they found handcuffs along with various knives and a large roll of plastic stashed underneath the tenant's bed. The man never returned to the apartment, and we ended up getting rid of all his things by the end of that month before cleaning and putting it back up for rent. I only worked at that job for another couple of months before a better position opened up at another building owned by the same company, and I never looked back.